Sraddhalu Ranade is a scientist, educationist and scholar. Based at the Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry, India, he specialized in physics, mathematics and computer science, integrating them seamlessly with his philosophical, metaphysical, spiritual studies. He has been involved in various kinds of research projects including artificial intelligence based on neural networks, multimedia search and retrieval, image processing and assorted simulation tools. He has also been deeply involved in media development, including television programming, software development, hardware design for over 25 years. A multifaceted personality, he has traveled widely and delivered talks and conducted workshops on numerous themes including integral education, management, self-development, Indian culture, science and spirituality, and yoga. He believes firmly that India is destined to lead the world into a new paradigm of science and human development based on a new consciousness. Without a further delay, I would like to invite our guest, Sri Sraddhalu Ranade, to give a talk on the Indian genius.
I'm struggling with a fundamental problem of the theme before us. To present a sweep of the Indian genius within 45 minutes. I made a rough note of the various areas that I would have liked to cover. And broadly, these would include philosophy, mathematics, engineering, physics, medicine, industry, trade, economy, polity, administration, society, warfare, arts, 64 arts, music, dance, literature, occult sciences, religion. And all of these presented in an integral, deeply interconnected vision and practice. Essentially epitomized in the science and technology of what we call yoga. This would be the broad sweep that I would like to present of the genius of India. Because India, unlike other civilizations, is the world's most ancient and the only ancient surviving civilization, which internally in our own history, in our own records, goes back at least 10,000 years of continuity. Yes, there has been much that has been destroyed in those records. But even in what survives, we have a continuity going back at least 10,000 years. Sequences, lineages of knowledge, of leadership, of kings, and so on, still surviving. Texts gathered, organized 10,000 years ago, still surviving. As a living tradition, not merely things placed in museums. There is no other such civilization in the world. And in the little glimpse that we have of this, we find this is the only civilization which has dared to explore every single field of human endeavor, without exception. And in each field that it has entered, it has excelled. It has achieved way beyond even anything else seen in the best of history. And in certain areas, gone far ahead even of what we have in the best of modern society today. Unfortunately, we are dealing here with a span of time so great that things do not survive. And I do not mean merely buildings. Even the forms of language, vocabulary changes with time. The meaning we give to a word 200 years ago has changed today. And what about a word that goes back 2,000 years or 10,000 years? And this is really the great problem we face when we read the Veda, for example. If we use the way a word is understood today in colloquial terms, we find often we are confused. We do not find consistency or continuity of meaning. And yet, we have the tradition still surviving that teaches us how to understand those words. because in the field of linguistics again, India excelled as no one else has. We have a whole science of linguistics, a science of language in which we go down to the very root sounds. And those root sounds are not arbitrary conventions as all the modern languages today are. When you use a word in the English language or any other modern language, your word has a meaning which is a convention. If you don't look up a dictionary, you don't know what the word means. But in Sanskrit, the starting point was different. Or let's say in the Indian culture, in the Indian tradition, the starting point was different. It was not what can you create. It was what is real, what is true, what is permanent, what is lasting. Can we capture that glimpse and articulate it? Perhaps articulate it in terms which are changing, in forms which are not lasting, and yet capture something that is eternal, expressed in time, expressed in space, expressed in changing circumstances. And Indian linguistics began thus. What are the fundamental, essential concepts and experiences of a fundamental reality? What are the natural corresponding sounds in which those experiences can be expressed? How can we naturally combine those sounds to articulate more complex structures of ideas and thought? And it is in this way that the Sanskrit language unfolds. And therefore we can say it is the only natural language. Interestingly, the characteristics of the language, unfortunately I can't go too deep into it for lack of time. The characteristic of the language is, if you have something to say, you can express it, even create a new vocabulary to express, and it will still be communicated. On the other hand, if you hear something which you do not know, you can go back into the root sounds and recover the essential meaning that's being communicated. Not only this is the case in the word formation, this is also the case in the structure, the grammatical structure of interconnections of these words, in which the semantic net, that is the interconnection of meanings between the words and key ideas, is actually held so tightly and so completely, you can rearrange sequences of words without losing the semantic communication and content of it. It is for this reason that one of the researchers at NASA, we are told, exclaimed that it's the best language for artificial intelligence. But it's not that Sanskrit was created for artificial intelligence. It was created as a natural expression to articulate what is true and permanent in terms which are changing. And this being the case, even what was expressed and articulated 10,000 years ago can be decoded. It takes effort though. When we do make that effort, we find extraordinary things. We find, for example, in the Vedas and later in the Upanishads, more obviously understood, the most profound philosophical concepts have been dealt with. They're so profound that the best of modern philosophy comes nowhere near. In fact, if you look back at the history of Europe and philosophy in Europe, you find philosophy got a boost in Europe when they began to study the Upanishads. And it was a link point with India, which was the cause of the Renaissance in Europe. And with that philosophical awakening began a series of other explorations, including mathematics, medicine, physics, chemistry, and so on, linking back to India for inspiration, which became the basis for the Renaissance and the subsequent, what we call, modern Western civilization. Even some of these things are so extraordinary and astounding, you'd be surprised to know that for 500 years there was a struggle in Europe to accept the Indian system of numbers. Why was there a struggle? The mathematicians said this is the way to go, it's the natural way to do it. The church said, if you allow the Hindu numerical system and Hindu way of calculation, then mathematics will become so simple, we will lose control over people's minds. For 500 years the struggle went on, until eventually, of course, what is true, real, natural comes forward. And then there is this huge renaissance. Chemistry, for example, even in Europe, traces back to experiments and production methods observed from India and then imported in Europe. I had recently visited an Ayurvedic surgical lab in India where they perform surgery in the old Ayurvedic method still even today. They showed me a picture of the instruments they use. And then they showed a picture of instruments used in modern surgery in a surgical theater. There is an exact correlation, one-to-one match. Why is that? Because the origin of European surgery was from a replication of an Indian surgical procedure observed by a Britisher, replicated there, who then claimed to be the father of modern surgery. Such are the deep links and correspondences with Europe that you will be surprised at how dependent the whole European awakening was on India. I was witness to an interesting display in the British Museum of Indian jewelry. And the note there said, and this was about 300 years ago, that this was the jewelry displayed from India in Paris in that period, and it astounded Europe. They could not imagine that such complex, intricate and beautiful work could be done by human hands. And it led to a renaissance in jewelry making, where they attempted to replicate the Indian jewelry, Indian patterns, and then they attempted to mechanize them. Unfortunately, very quickly, India had come under colonial rule, and we missed the industrial revolution that was beginning then all over the world. But the principles of that industry were already present in India. And as you know, India, it has been observed, India had this enormous manufacturing base. It had the only sustained economy going back at least 5,000 years, entirely dependent on its own production, not based on theft of others. If you look back at the great empires of the last 2,000 years, each one of them built their greatness on conquest of others, on taking the resources from others, turning others into slaves and raw material for their richness. The moment they lost their colonies, they became poor again. India was the only civilization which sustained economic development without taking from others, but giving more than it took. What was the basis and principle on which they developed such a sustainable lifestyle? In fact, there are extraordinary examples of how influential this was purely at the level of trade and production. You have in the Roman history, during the Roman Empire, an emergency meeting recorded of the Senate in which they discuss the problem of trade with India. And the problem is that Indian goods are so competitive and so good that the whole Roman Empire is importing from India, and there is a massive loss to the exchequer. They are about to lose their reserves. And they pass a ban order preventing the Roman Empire from importing too many goods from India. Similarly, when the trade route, land route was blocked from India to Europe, the French kings passed a ban order saying Indian textiles can only be purchased by the French royalty because there is a major lack at present. You look back at the culture of the British and the times and the mindset, and you find Shakespeare in his book. You've seen The Merchant of Venice. Why was Venice so important? Why was he Merchant of Venice? It's just a tiny trading port, it's a trading island. Why was it so great? Because it was the link point for all the ships from India coming into Europe. And the Merchant of Venice suddenly becomes rich at the end of the story because his 3 ships have arrived from India. It's like today, if you say, oh, I have got this export order to the US, you've made it. It was the kind of thinking that existed in Europe. Oh, you got a link from India, your ship has come back from India, you've made it. Because India was the focal point for wealth. I'm pointing to this aspect of wealth because today, that's the value which we have. If a country is strong and rich, we respect it. But it is a falsehood to say that India, because she was spiritual, was not strong or rich. So I'm emphasizing some of these examples to point out India was the only sustainable economy which impacted the whole world, and in terms of strength, we had the world's largest shipbuilding industry, producing ships which could go across the ocean for 6 months, carrying all the food supplies and people in it. For 6 months without stopping at a port. And this involves very advanced navigation skills. When Vasco da Gama was heading for India, he was hugging the coast. He was afraid to go out into the ocean. And at some point on the African coast, he bumped into a ship which was 3 times the size of his ship. It was a trader from Gujarat. And Vasco da Gama said, I want to go to India. I don't know how to go, I'm scared. The trader said, follow me. And he followed the rest of the journey behind these big ships from the Indian traders. That's how he came to India. He was a man who was afraid. But these were people who had extensive shipping links widely spread. This is the reason why to this day it is called the Indian Ocean and not the African Ocean. Africa has a bigger coastline, but India dominated the trade, and in strength, in warfare, even on the sea, we had a naval tradition of protection. You'd be surprised to know perhaps that Shivaji had a massive battle out there in the sea with the Portuguese because he was protecting the coastline with 200 ships. And there was a massive gun battle across ships in the waters in which Shivaji won. This is recorded and is in fact displayed by the Indian Navy as one of the early traditions of warfare in the sea. But I give these examples because most of us are not aware of these things, because unfortunately, as you know, history is written by the conquerors. And especially when the British realized that their entire empire depended on wealth from India, they realized it was not enough to control India militarily, they had to conquer the minds of people. And it was by this conquest of the mind that they changed the content of what is taught. And you know the subsequent results. I am pointing to that period before, where the mindset of the Indian civilization was not that of slaves. It was of leaders. It was of people with great courage and strength and tremendous vitality, a tremendous power of intellect, and a very practical organizational sense. These are 3 characteristics that Sri Aurobindo points to, which are at the heart of the achievements of the Indian civilization. First, a brilliant intellect, which did not stop at superficial appearances but penetrated through to the core issues. Second, a tremendous vitality and a courage to explore everything without fear. A third, a very practical application by which all of this exploration and knowledge was brought down to an applied level in the form of Shastra, manual of application. And we have a Shastra for everything. Everything without exception. Those Shastras may perhaps not be relevant today, because when you go to practical application, things change, circumstances change. But the principles behind them are still applicable today. Among those Shastras, we find certain applications, certain technologies, certain sciences even, of which we have no equivalent today, which are far ahead of anything we have. And one example I will refer to, because I have spent particular energies and time to explore it, is the Vimana Shastra. Some of you may have heard of it. Vimana, as you know, means aeroplane. There is a Shastra of aeroplane, which not only teaches you how to construct an aeroplane, it not only gives you the specific alloys necessary to make the aeroplane, it teaches you the kinds of dresses that the pilot should wear to protect himself against different kinds of radiation. And it categorizes different kinds of radiation at different heights from the earth. It makes a distinction between flight in the atmosphere, flight in outer space, and flight across in the solar system, and the different kinds of radiations and dangers at each of these levels. It specifies kinds of food the pilot should eat. It specifies the kinds of machines, 32 machines, which make the aircraft complete. Among the machines are things which we cannot even imagine, things which are also we have developed. I give 2 examples, 3 examples perhaps. One is Apasmara Dhuma Prasarana Yantra. Apasmara, forgetfulness. Dhuma, smoke. Prasarana, spreading. Yantra, machine. Machine that spreads the smoke of forgetfulness. When the Vimana operates during war, It can spread the smoke which knocks out people, makes them unconscious. This is something we have done today. But imagine a description like this existing then. And then there is Tamo Garbha Yantra, which has no equivalent today. Tamo Garbha, Tamo darkness, Garbha womb, machine which produces darkness from its womb. And the description goes, when you switch on this machine, it can create darkness in the middle of daytime. We do not have the necessary scientific understanding even to speculate how such a machine would work. Because in fact, we don't understand light. We call it as electromagnetic waves. Waves in what? How? How does empty space carry electromagnetism as a magnetic and electrical field at right angles? Why does a changing magnetic field produce an electrical field and vice versa? We do not know these things. Our physics is a description and not an explanation. We have formulas which describe behaviors. We do not explain why they are what they are. But they did go into that level. They did go to that depth and thereby develop technologies which even to this day we find difficult to understand. There is another interesting description of a glass and the whole process of manufacturing it, in which you can see other Vimanas flying all around like dots, like stars in the sky. This is a very interesting description, similar to what we have as a display in a radar, where you see each plane in a point. Now these descriptions were all documented in this book Vimana Shastra, and actual metallic formula given there. Unfortunately, the formulas are difficult to decode because they involve technical terms we don't fully understand. And they recently, Dr. C.S.R. Prabhu in Hyderabad replicated, he has decoded about 16 formulas so far. He replicated 3 or 4 of them. Among them was a material which belongs to the Tamo Garbha Yantra. He developed from that formula a ferrite material which was absorbing something like 94% of light shone on it. He developed from those formulas a copper alloy which is harder than steel and which doesn't corrode in seawater. And as evidence that these things actually existed then, he also got a piece of copper alloy from Dwarika which has been sitting underwater for the last 5,000 years. It has not corroded. And it shows you that these things did exist. But why is it we do not have a continuity of these traditions to this day? And we must understand the civilization is far more ancient than any sense of time that any of the Western cultures give us. We are going back, remember, 10,000 years. And the civilization documents a period of breakdown and decline at the end of the Mahabharata, the beginning of the Kali Yuga. And at that point, there is a deliberate decision made by those who know, who have these advanced technologies and knowledge and science, to withdraw it from public. Already many of these things, because they are so powerful in their potential for misuse, they were kept secret. But then the knowledge was withdrawn during that period in the beginning of the age of darkness. This is recorded. And so we must understand, when we refer to achievements of this civilization, it's not enough to go back 2,000 years. We have to go back way before to see the true peaks. And I have given a long list of so many things which are areas of achievement. But I want to go back to the essence of the motivating drive of this culture. What made it so great and so capable that even to this day, when all other cultures have declined, collapsed, and have had to rebuild, if at all, or have ceased to be what they were, this culture is still thriving in spite of the period and the passage of extreme destruction under colonial rule. What is it that drives this? And I want to go back to this because it's the question of greatest relevance for today. The technology of the Vimana Shastra surviving is not important. The inspiration which made the Indian genius realize those things then, that is important. Because with that inspiration, we can recreate everything, and perhaps far better than anything which was achieved in the past. In one of the inspiring lines, Sri Aurobindo says, we do not belong to the past dawns, but to the noons of the future. Whatever was achieved then, however great, was only a beginning. There is so much more to be done. And it was Swami Vivekananda who first exclaimed, India is destined to be the guru of the world. And as guru, she is not merely somebody who will come and preach to you the spirituality. That would be meaningless, empty, hollow. It has to be a mastery of all life on the foundations of the spirit. Then only you can say this is worthwhile to follow. If it says you will be weak, you will be poor, but you will gain God, it's not good enough. And there is a distinction between guru and, as was pointed out earlier, acharya. But there's another word also we use, shikshak. The English word teacher actually translates as shikshak, one who teaches. Acharya is different. Acharya is greater than a teacher. Acharya is who shows by example. His achara leads you. He is not merely one who preaches to you and tells you what's right. He shows you by example. A guru is even greater. A guru gives you an experience. He gives you a realization in whatever field it is. It could be spiritual, it could be music, it could be dance. That is why in the Indian tradition, where music and dance have survived in the original lineages, we still call them guru, because they give you the experience of that realization of music or dance. And what is that experience? It goes to the very core of things to realize the essence, the deepest, permanent, lasting truths in that field of expression of music or dance. We had an interesting interview with one of the very famous musicians of today, and I think it was Ustad Vilayat Khan. And he said, we asked him these questions. Normally these are not the questions people ask in an interview, but we did. And we asked him, what is your experience when you sing? Where are you? What do you see? What do you feel? And then he said, within me is God. Before me is God. Everywhere it is only God. This is an experience which can lead to a realization through the passage gateway of music. It is that which makes the Indian music great. I give this example because this gives us a clue to the very essential motivation and inspiration of the Indian culture. If you look at all the cultures of the world, you will find they have been inspired by some ideal. As long as they followed that ideal, they became great. When they turned away from the ideal, they fell. If you look at Greece, the ideal was elegance of thought, beauty of form. So you had the Greek philosophers who sat and discussed in the marketplace beautiful ideas. They didn't care if it's true or false. It's a beautiful idea. It's a fun experience in itself. And that has been the characteristic of the Greek civilization. Where they turned away from that ideal, the civilization itself fell. Rome as a culture and civilization was defined by the ideal of law and order and discipline. It is that which made it great. When it turned away from that, it fell. And it is in fact these two mixtures of the Greek and Roman ideals which spread in Europe, which have defined the character of the European civilization today. Discipline, order, structure, with elegance of ideas and thought and form, and it stops with that. And you can see the hollowness of it also. Beautiful form, but it's hollow. The core is missing. You look at the Hebrew civilization, the ideal there is ethics, morality, do's and don'ts, rights and wrongs, and their whole book is about that. The 10 Commandments. There are commandments, this is good, the rest is bad. If you look at Japan, the motivating ideal of the civilization is love of art. And anything they do must be artistically done. Whether the manner in which you wear a dress in your own room alone, or whether you sit down to make a cup of tea, sitting alone or to a guest, or a little kitchen garden, whatever it is, you make it artistic and beautiful. And when you go to Japan, you will find everything spontaneously. Even in the common man, there is this feel of beauty. When the cherry blossoms bloom, you will find the Japanese going out in droves, sitting in nature, admiring the beauty of the flowers. That is gone deep into the very grain of their personality and character. What is it that motivated India? And the key word of Indian civilization has been spirituality. And as deeply as the sense of beauty has gone into the Japanese civilization and its people, so deeply spirituality has gone in the Indian people and Indian cultures and values and forms of life. We are not conscious of it, that's all. It was the late General B.C. Joshi, Chief of Indian Army, who once observed in an interview. He said, "It is my experience that in the very genes of every Indian is spirituality." And this is a man who should know. He is dealing with 3 million people who are willing to give up their lives to defend you and I. And spirituality is the motivating factor, even there. We do not fight because we hate the other. We fight because we love an ideal, because we love our motherland. It's a very different motivation from the soldier on the other side who fights because he hates or because he has been brainwashed. And this is at the heart of the Indian people, the spirituality. But how does spirituality work to give us physics and mathematics and engineering and music or dance? What's the connection? Spirituality is something out there, isn't it? And when we go back to the very core and beginning of the foundation of our culture, what do we go back to? The Veda. Every tradition in India to this day declares itself authentic by reconnecting to the Veda and say, we draw inspiration from the Veda. What was so great about the Veda? It was an extraordinary revelation and articulation. Although not fully understood today, we still feel that it is something so great and true. In the Vedic period, the rishis set the type of the Indian civilization by their experiences, by their profound realizations, which they articulated in the Veda. It is for this reason that even when it is not fully understood, we still preserve the Veda with such accuracy that after at least 7,000 years, we still have no errors. And you know how the system of coding was used for storing the text of the Veda, although by memory. We had systems of what they call redundancy, and in the computer system we call it the redundant byte, which is there to preserve the checksum. We had a system of checksums in the transmission of the Vedic verses to ensure that there is no corruption. This is the kind of information that has been preserved there. But what was it really holding? And when we go back to the essential experience of the Vedic rishis, they went all the way through to the origin. They looked at the world and said, the appearance is not the reality. And they peeled off layer by layer the appearances. Now this process is no different from modern science. Modern science also concludes the appearance is not the reality. This is actually molecules. That is molecules. And the molecules, you remove that layer, they are atoms, elements. You remove that layer and behind that there are electrons, protons, neutrons. Behind that there's another layer which is subatomic particles interweaving in constant flux, unstable. Peel off that layer and you find an ocean of energy. What is modern science doing? It is pursuing a quest for reality by peeling off the layers of appearance. What did the Vedic rishis do? Exactly the same thing. They used different means. They used an internal subjective means, while modern science uses external objective means. But they came to similar conclusions. What does modern science say? All this ultimately is an ocean of energy. And it concludes and measures that energy by, you're familiar with the term 0-point energy? It's a pure mathematical conclusion from quantum physics that in a tiny cubic millimeter of air, of space, of empty vacuum, is enough energy to evaporate all the oceans of the earth. Where is that energy coming from? In fact, all of this form which we see is nothing but foam structures on that underlying energy. That's what modern science teaches us. But where did that energy come from? How does it move in these rhythms which we call laws of physics? Why is E equals mc square and not mc cube? Well, we don't know. And that's where science stops and says, beyond this, it goes into a domain which I can only speculate, I cannot observe. The moment you cross the quantum levels, you cannot directly observe anymore. Reality escapes your grasp of the sensory observation and you enter domain of speculation. The rishis, though, approached it differently. By pursuing a subjective quest, they came to the same conclusion. They said all matter ultimately is energy, Shakti. But they went further and said that energy is not mechanical energy, it is Chit Shakti, conscious energy. And this was the key, the breakthrough. It is conscious energy which consciously chooses certain rhythms, freely chooses rhythms of its own articulation. And that's what makes for the laws of physics. Recognizing this and subjectively pursuing that quest, identifying with that consciousness, they found they could choose freely from that domain, from that level, to modify the existing rhythms. And from there was born their knowledge of science and their technologies. And therefore, they could gain extraordinary insights into material processes, which to this day we cannot replicate. An example standing before us all over India is the non-rusting iron. The iron pillar in Delhi is the famous example, but there are at least 200 sites in India where iron is exposed to rain and sun and wind but does not rust. How did they make it? All of our spectroscopic analysis does not reveal the secret. How did they do it? Well, they used means, they used methods which we do not fully understand. There are materials which they developed which even to this day we cannot replicate. As I mentioned in the Vimana Shastra, there are actually materials which have characteristics of what we call today metamaterials or quasi-metamaterials. This is a domain which we are just beginning to explore, and still from a very superficial approach, they went from within out and they could shape materials. They could overrule, override or modify even what we call laws of physics. Of course, it can appear as a simple miracle, but the goal was not a miraculous intervention, but a mastery of life and of matter. They went still further. Chit Shakti, where did that come from? And they went deeper and deeper, all the way to the ultimate essence, which they described and articulated in words, in philosophies, while still building sciences out of it. And then the most interesting part was this. They answered the question, from where did the Big Bang come? It's a question science cannot answer. Do you know why? Because when you go back to the point of the Big Bang, you find all of your equations collapse. As you approach, this is pure general relativity, as you approach the point of Big Bang in time, you find there is this huge big crunch, the whole of mass of space is condensed into a tiny bit, the gravitational field folds space upon itself, time slows down until at the point of the Big Bang, space collapses into a singularity, time stops. And therefore the question, what came before the Big Bang or what caused the Big Bang, has no meaning for science, because space and time do not exist for that. Science stops. Because science has started with form and is stuck with form. But the internal subjective pursuit of the Rishi went back to that point and the thing behind it. And they came to this conclusion, that from which the universe came is spaceless, timeless, indivisibly one, and yet holding all potential. And it is pure awareness, formless, essential awareness. And that awareness has in it intrinsic power of awareness to articulate itself in form, in limitation. And this is the power with which the whole universe is born, and so on. The whole sequence from that stage up to here, down to the molecule and the atom, has been articulated in sequence. How does that which is indivisible and formless express itself in divided forms? It's an important philosophical or metaphysical question. It's a physics question ultimately. They answered it. It goes through 5 layers of self-modification, Pancha Mahabhutas. And once you understand that principle, you get the key of manipulation of form itself. You find the key of how to evoke any quality out of any object. And if you observe what modern technology is doing, not yet science, but technology, I make a distinction. What modern technology is doing is precisely that, drawing out qualities out of objects which didn't have those qualities. A silicon wafer, a piece of sand, which is nothing but transparent crystalline structure, out of that we have done so much. All of our electronics is based on that. We make it conductive and semiconductive. And the latest discovery is how we can make it give off light and make it transmit light, create waveguides for light, and so on. These are qualities which are not inherent to the sand, and yet we draw out those qualities. That's the essence of technology. But they developed a science which explains how any quality can be drawn out of any other. And the whole of terminology for this science exists to this day. All of these key words which we use, this is tamas, rajas and sattva. These three, this triple principle, is at the heart of that. The Pancha Mahabhutas are at the heart of that. And with those fundamental principles, they have articulated the whole unfoldment. And the interesting part is, because they saw everything coming out from the same oneness, they saw the interconnection of everything. And therefore you will find no field of exploration is in isolation in the Indian tradition. If you take simply Ayurveda, you would say, oh, it's health. It's actually science of life, Ayu. In Ayurveda, not only do you have the means for cure of diseases, but you also have a whole development of food and the effect of food. And the food itself is made the medicine. This is the only civilization in which food is your medicine. Interesting, isn't it? Because they understood the qualities and properties of each food. And they made it tasty. And the result today is, when modern science explores the characteristics of our key ingredients of Indian food, they come out with, oh, this is anti-cancer, this is anti-this, anti-that. If you just eat healthy Indian cooking, well, you get all the Ayurvedic benefits. But they went further. They saw the prakriti, the various psychological types and natures of human beings. They went from the physical, biological basis of illness to the psychological basis of illness. They found means to intervene on all these levels. Your thoughts, your emotions have a physical effect on the biology. Can we create a medicine which, taken at the biological level, can affect your thoughts and emotions and heal illnesses on those levels? Yes, we can. Can you create a science which describes this whole process? Yes, they did. This is just one example, one glimpse when you look at Ayurveda alone. And all of it traces back to the knowledge of the oneness out of which the whole multiplicity comes. And so it was for all fields. Even if you take a simple system or a simple science of making a city, and we had Shastras for that, they started with fundamentals. Every complete unit, they said, must represent the only thing which is complete, which is that. So the design of the city itself must replicate that and the completeness of that. Interesting idea, isn't it? The micro world, the macro world and the micro world are interconnected. Microcosm and the macrocosm are related. Yatha pinde tatha brahmande. As in the unit, so in the whole. And the unit is complete when it replicates the whole. And so on. So in each field, they went to fundamentals from the origin and then developed the full science and mastery of the most detailed processes. This is the fundamental inspiration of the Indian civilization, the spiritual. And you can see how the spiritual here is not cut off from the world. Rather, it is the foundation of life and it is the fulfillment of life. It's the perfection of life. It's the mastery of life. It is from this basis, from this inspiration, that they had this tremendous intellectual power developed. An intellectual power so great that examples of it today are very few. Swami Vivekananda is one of the great giants of modern history who had that kind of an intellect. But we do not find too many today. And yet, they developed a science by which we can develop that kind of a power of mind. There was a means, a whole training system, and the knowledge of that still survives, though in fragments. Unfortunately, it is not compatible with our modern educational system. The modern educational system starts from the other end. It starts by stuffing facts into you. Our original system of education began by training the mind and the power of thought. And Swami Vivekananda once exclaimed, "If I had to do my education all over again, I would not waste time learning subjects. I would develop to perfection the power of concentration and the power of equality. And having mastered both, I could master any subject at will." Think about it. And I'm leaving here this only as a clue for their approach to development of thought power. With that kind of thought power, we had geniuses galore in Indian history. And in each field, we have these geniuses. Just in the field of literature, the genius of Kalidasa is so great. He has so many different styles, so many approaches. He weaves into his dramas not only the thrill of the narration, the beauty of the literature, but also the profound philosophical insights into human nature, into life in the world. He weaves it all together. That's what makes Kalidasa so great. And in that, he has so many styles. He switches from one style to another as if a different person. The result is, when modern European analysts look at his writings, they say, Kalidasa cannot have been one man. One man cannot write so much with so much diversity. He must have been 4 different people. But for the Indian tradition, this is the sign of genius. In the West, genius is a specialization in a narrow track. In the Indian tradition, genius was this multifaceted mastery of multiple fields, interwoven, interconnected. Only today, gradually, we are coming to the realization that we made an error by cutting up knowledge into subjects. And the real breakthroughs today are beginning in what we call the interdisciplinary fields. But that concept was always inherent in the Indian tradition. We always saw knowledge as one. And there is the famous incident in the Upanishad where this young boy who has been sent for training comes back to his father, who is a great rishi himself. And the young boy says, the father asks, "What have you learnt, my son?" And the young boy says, "I have learned this, I have mastered that," and he lists a whole range of things. And then the father asks, "Have you learnt that by knowing which all is known?" And the boy says, "Is there such a thing? If so, please teach me." And then the father begins to reveal to him the knowledge of that by which all is known. Now these are profound traditions. And they are not merely speculative traditions, they are realizations. That's why they were great gurus, which they have transmitted, and in a way that we can gain those realizations even today. When India turned away from this spiritual approach to mastery of life, the civilization went into decline. It was a necessary phase. Let's look at it that way. From the larger perspective, Sri Aurobindo observes that God always keeps for himself one country in which through all the ravages of time, the highest knowledge is preserved. And then he writes, at least for this Chatur Yuga, that country is India. And he explains that when God wants to enjoy his poverty and his weakness, then he withdraws the knowledge and the strength, and India falls. When God once again wants to play at the full revelation of his glory, then once again he fills that light and strength into India, and there is the blooming of the civilization. We can look at it from that higher perspective. But from a historical perspective, we will say, when the civilization turned away from its spiritual foundations, it began a decline. And the decline ended with weakening of the civilization, which allowed invasions to take place. Let's be clear about this. The invasions were always attempted. Barbarians always surround a civilization. They always try to break in. And we have even, going back, a record of the invasion attempted by Alexander, quote, the Great. He was called the Great by his own people, not by the Indian people. He had a series of battles on the borderline of India. Now, why did he come to India? He set out by declaring that he will conquer the world. And to conquer the world, he does not conquer 20 villages around him. He must conquer the most powerful country, isn't it? That's India. The wealthiest country, that's India. So first he makes a beeline to India because he wants to conquer the world, and India is the center of the world. On the border of India, he breaks down. He cannot get through. In fact, he could reach India because the bulk of his soldiers who fought, the bravest of them, were Indian mercenaries. And as they came to the border of India, the Indian mercenaries said, "We won't fight our own people. We want to go back." Alexander said, "Fine, you can go back, but without your weapons." And entire families of these mercenaries, fighters with their families and children, all were released without weapons. As soon as they left, Alexander turned to his soldiers, his generals, and said, "If those people fight me, I will never conquer India. Go out immediately and slaughter all of them." They were all butchered. This is the man who was called the Great, of course by his own people, not by the Indians. When this man came to the border of India, he faced repeated defeats until his soldiers became tired and said, "We want to go back." And at that point, when he turned back, the message he couldn't give that I have lost. So he made the story, I have won, but I gave back the kingdom that I won. Would you believe that? A man who kills, butchers his own mercenaries who have given him all the victories, would he give back a kingdom that he has won? Interestingly, among the Greek historians, there are historians who say that he lost so badly and he came away. Who says that he won? Unfortunately, that's one of the little stories that one historian in Greece records, which is Alexander's personal historian. It's the same story we find when Cleopatra lost to the Roman Empire. She came back and announced, "I have won, let's celebrate. I have made peace with the Romans because I won." It's a similar story. I give this example because the battling, the power of the Kshatriya in India was so great. Nobody could make a dent into this protected space. It is only when we turned away from the roots of our civilization, everything weakened. Thought power weakened, vitality weakened, and the invasions became possible. At that point comes a gradual reversal. Through the invasions, there is the battling, the shock, and the awakening to find our roots again. This is the transition point we are at. Why have we fallen? Why have we become so weak? And there's a whole introspection that begins. In the last phase, there was also the suppression of the Indian mind, where an alien system of education was imposed upon us, alien values were brought in, and the Indian mind itself suffered an onslaught to fragment it. And I'm making this very clear, conscious observation with this vocabulary. Sri Aurobindo makes a distinction between the characteristic of the Indian mind and the characteristic of the European mind. Your European mind, by temperament, looks at pieces, looks at forms, and remains with forms. The Indian mind, by temperament, looks at wholes, completes the full picture, and tries to go to the essence. It's not something you and I have done. It's something our forefathers have done. We only benefit from the momentum or the gift of their realizations. And it's there as a tendency within us. It doesn't mean we have it. It's a tendency. When upon this tendency you put a contrary tendency and impose it as the right way to do things, you're not good at it. You're a poor slave. And you try harder to be a better slave, well, you will fail. You are poor at looking at superficialities and looking at pieces. If you try harder to do it, well, it won't be very successful. But if you return to your own native way of being, native way of thinking, native way of relating to life, then you will be full and you will be successful. Following your own innate swadharma of the civilization is the way by which we will grow. And what is that swadharma of the civilization? Go back to the fundamentals. And the fundamentals can be seen subjectively or objectively. Objectively, as we have described, you can look at the fundamentals of everything. Why do you do this? Why do you do it? And keep asking why, and you'll come to some insight. Subjectively, who am I? I'm not this person who's merely thinking and feeling. Where does the thought power come? Where does this ability to stand back from my thoughts come? And I introspect subjectively. And I ask, why am I here? Am I merely a product of chance, as modern science teaches us? Some molecules fell into place, we happen to be here. If that be the case, then the only meaning to life is make the most of every moment, enjoy yourself, let the future go to blazes. That's what the Western civilization is doing. It has been the most destructive civilization in human history. All of the mess that you see of all the forests being cut, the rivers being polluted, human life being destroyed, human babies being poisoned deliberately with full awareness, is the outcome of a civilization that looks only at the present, ignores the future. In our tradition, as in many other indigenous traditions, the teaching was to look at the next 7 generations. Every decision you take today, think of its consequences for 7 generations. Ayurveda tells you the food you eat, the habits you inculcate in your body today will transmit for 7 generations in your lineage. Choose carefully. Be conscious. Be aware of the whole and the implications in a long span of the timeless. Eternity is native to the Indian mind. Infinity is native to the Indian mind. These are precious values, precious sensitivities. Do not make the error of imitating and being a poor imitation of the West. Because the future of the world is not in that short-term thinking. It is in this foundation on which the Indian civilization was built. But we are passing through a passage. It is a Yuga Sandhi, the breakdown of an age and the beginning of a new age, in which the very things which made the old age great are breaking down. The forms of the past are breaking apart. You cannot go back to those forms. But remember, our civilization was not founded on forms. It was founded on the fundamentals. And if we go back to the fundamentals, we will new create the forms. Or perhaps we will take up old forms and enliven them with new inspirations. Or as we create a new form, we will discover, oh, this is the same form that they did. But we will be expressing them as our spontaneous truth of today. And for that, we must go back to our deepest foundations, individually and collectively. Stop imitating the West. I'm going to give a very practical example of how that imitation has destroyed our national life. And I look at simply the structure of modern politics in India. When we won our freedom, the very first step we took was to copy the British Constitution, to continue the same governance structures that the British left us. And they didn't design the government for governance, they designed it for exploitation. Remember, they were colonizers. The most powerful man at the ground level was the man who took the taxes, the collector. To this day, the collector remains the most powerful man. Why? And the government is still designed for sucking out your lifeblood, not for serving the people. We continue to fear the government as we used to fear the colonizers. And that's not a healthy relationship for a healthy country. The government should fear the people. That's how it should be, if at all. Fear should be there. Rather, it should be a partnership of trust, mutually helping each other. None of that is possible in a lopsided system designed for exploitation, where at the top you have no accountability. At the bottom, you have no flexibility. It does not work. It has destroyed the country. Worse still, we copied a constitution. And the constitution itself was made by a patchwork by a committee of 300 people, not a single mind, not from fundamentals. What are we here for? What does our nation mean to us? None of these questions were taken up. And the result was, we have a parliamentary model of democracy, which does not work for India. Sri Aurobindo observed 100 years ago, 1910, he said, India will pass through the experiment of parliamentary democracy simply to realize it is not suited for us. 100 years have passed and we still have the mess. And he explained why. He said, the Indian mind wants to choose its king. And therefore, the presidential model is more appropriate for that, because we want to choose the man that we trust. Let's see what happens when we have a parliamentary model. You have a party representative standing locally. Do you trust him? Do you know him? No. Does he act for himself? Does he act for truth? No. He represents a party. Do you know the party? No way. I'll give an example. 1984, when Rajiv Gandhi stood for elections, overwhelmingly the country voted for him. Why? We trusted him. He was fresh, he was new, he was unpolluted. What do you have to do to vote him to power? You cannot vote for him in the parliamentary model. You vote for his party's representative, the same old crook who's been with you the last 20 years. You know he's a crook, but you have to vote for him because you want this honest man to come in. And all the crooks get to parliament and still you have no guarantee they will choose the man you want for prime minister. That's how corruption starts, because of the indirect election system of the parliamentary model. Let's take a practical example. If it was a governance based on the need of the Indian type for the Indian mind, a presidential model, suppose Abdul Kalam stood. There are no parties. He stands alone. He would win hands down because we trust him. And as a man whom we trust, he would be free to build his own team. And because we trust him, we know that his team also will live up. And then imagine the kind of governance you might have. As efficient, as effective as the defense program that he oversaw. Yes, this is possible. But for that, we must actually say enough of the false imitations. We need to question ourselves, go back to our fundamentals and recast, rebuild our life. When Swami Vivekananda said India is destined to be the guru of the world, that's the destiny waiting, pressing upon us. But we are still chasing illusions and falsehoods. And when the destiny presses while we ignore it, there is a crushing breakup. That's what we are seeing today in our national life. And the breakup is of the forms which are false. The transition will have to be a revolution. I often put it in this way. The freedom movement was left incomplete. We won our political freedom, but we didn't recast the whole system. In terms of governance, we replaced the British by the same mindset. The first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, was not elected by the people. You're aware of that? The very first step of democracy was crushed. It was Sardar Patel who was elected by the party. At that point, Mahatma Gandhi stepped in and asked him to step down because I have promised Nehru's father I'll make him Prime Minister. He was selected, bypassing the will of the electoral process. The same principle continues to this day. The Prime Minister is not chosen by you and I. He is selected by an extra constitutional authority. Worse still, in that very first step, many more things happened. The mindset which came in, Jawaharlal Nehru shared with the American ambassador then, Kenneth Galbraith. He said, you know, I am the last Englishman to rule India. And you see, there are two perversions here. He didn't see himself as an Indian, he saw himself as an Englishman. You see the same mindset continuing. And second, he saw his role as Prime Minister not to serve India, but to rule India. And you have the same mindset continuing. Everybody who gets elected to Parliament starts ruling people rather than serving people. What we need today is the completion of the freedom movement, where the entire governance structure needs to be recast. The economic model of development needs to be recast. The cultural framework, we are still strapped by alien influences dominating in the name of freedom of the press or freedom of society or freedom of television, whatever form it takes. We don't have a chance to express freely what is innate to us. And most important, the need for the freedom of the Indian mind. And the educational system today drills into you the falsehood of starting with informational rote learning. Does not promote creativity, does not promote individuality, does not promote your own innate svabhava. All of this needs to undergo a massive change. It is only as a result of these that India will move closer to her destined place as the Guru of the world. But at the foundation of all these changes is the fundamental shift in consciousness in our sense of identity, purpose, and inspiration, to realign ourselves with the spiritual inspiration at the foundation of our civilization. You cannot make the social, economic, educational, and governance changes if you do not make this internal change. That's why the revolution will start within us by an internal awakening within, which will energize the mind, energize our energies, energize our actions, inspire for the new creation. And let's not avoid facing this fact: the entire national life needs to be rebuilt. We cannot say any more things are fine as they are. Nothing is fine as it is. But to build that, we must have the inner foundations. And I won't say first, I will say we have to work at both simultaneously. You can't wait and say, when in the next 50 years I will attain self-realization, then I will have the true knowledge, and then I will make the effort. My body won't support it. It has to be simultaneous. At each step that we make an effort and action, align it to your deepest accessible awareness and aspiration. There is the famous phrase in Sanskrit, Chitte vachi kriyayam cha sadhunam ekarupata. In thought, in speech, in action, there is a continuity of alignment in the good person. That alignment then points to your deepest aspiration. And let's face it, as I said earlier, the deep foundations of Indian spirituality are in our genes. If we become quiet for a moment, we will feel deep in our heart the thing which inspires us. I had an interesting professor of philosophy in the ashram, and he once told us, when he had visited UK for the first time, they asked him, what is special about Indian civilization or Indian culture? So the professor turned to him and said, can you sit quiet for a minute without thinking and moving? And the fellow said, no, I can't. He said, any Indian can do that. It's an interesting observation, because that foundation of equality or silence, or the capacity to become quiet, to turn inwards and become aware of something deep within us, that is as if innate. It is rusty because we have not consciously developed it. Or if we have consciously attempted to develop it, we can rapidly make the contact easily. Again, not because of anything we have done or achieved. It is the gift of our forefathers in the underlying cultural values in which we grew up, in the atmosphere of this sacred space that is Bharat. And we are fortunate to be born here in this culture. But the opportunity is wasted if we are not conscious of it and do not make the most by conscious effort. This is the most critical next step. And I'll articulate it in this way, very simple, very practical, superficial perhaps, but as a starting point it's very good. Spend 5 minutes every day, alone, cut off from the whole world, and becoming very quiet in your mind and in your heart, become conscious of your deepest and highest aspiration. You may not be able to describe it in words or in thoughts, but you will feel it deep within you. Center your whole being around that. And then from that center, turn to face the whole world. And in every thought, speech, and action, to the extent possible, try to align to that center during the rest of the day. If this much all of us can do, then the revolution will already have started, and all the rest will follow, and India will take truly her destined place as the Guru of the world. Namaste.
As I expected, the talk was simply riveting, and this has brought forth many questions to surface. So I would like to open the floor for questions. So if you have any, you can ask directly here.
How much time do we have? Okay. We have about 15 minutes, and I would invite you to ask any question freely about anything. We have covered a very wide gamut, so you should feel free to say anything. It's okay, thank you. Yes, you can get up and speak.
Good evening, sir. I just want to know that the Shastras you have mentioned, Vimana Shastra you have mentioned, that was so fascinating. Can you give me how many names, or I don't know how they have built the Shastras, but can you hint me the overview of how many Shastras or the kind of approach?
I think the Shastras are innumerable, and not too many, not all of them have survived. But the Shastras themselves were practical manuals of articulation of fundamental principles. So the general recommendation was to go back to fundamentals and then recast from there. And those fundamentals you will generally find traced back to the Upanishads and the Veda. The Veda are not as easily accessible as are the Upanishads, and I would suggest you might start with the study of the Asia Upanishad, which catches the fundamental opposites of the cosmos and then reconciles them. And that's an excellent way of starting, even to train your mind as well as a deeper understanding of things. And then those principles you find reflected all over, echoing in every field once you catch that principle. The universe itself is a fractal. You're familiar with the concept of a fractal. The same image replicates itself in all the parts. It is also another way of saying it is a hologram. It is a whole, a totality, and every part reflects the totality. So if you catch the fundamental principles, you will find they operate in every field. So it's a good way to start your quest of training. But otherwise, you could go to specifics, take up these texts, for example, Vimana Shastra, and explore that, experiment with some of those ideas. Some of them, because they are just specific articulations, you can do the experiment straight away and replicate that particular metallic alloy. But you may not understand the principle by which that was developed.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. My name is Sandeep. I was extremely excited when you came to the topic of the point of creation,
Yes.
and you actually went beyond and said that we knew what is actually before that. Of course, you mentioned about oneness and everything, but
Yes.
I still really did not get the full clarity of that concept.
Okay. You can approach that origin of it all from various perspectives. And this is a physics perspective that I take when I say that if you go back in time to the moment of the Big Bang, we find space and time break down into what is called a singularity. You're familiar with the concept of singularity. Now I'll put it in the mathematical terms. A singularity is a point where all the equations break down into 0 divided by 0. That symbol itself is fascinating, and you're familiar with the maths of, okay? You're familiar with the maths here, and most of you would be. So let me just play with the symbol of 0 divided by 0. As you know, any number divided by 0 is infinity. 0 divided by any number is 0. But 0 divided by 0 is a peculiar creature, and in mathematics we say it is undefined. Which means what? It means it actually can represent any number. No. Actually that means it represents all possible numbers. Depending on how you approach 0 divided by 0, by what series, you will find it is 1, it is 2, it is 3, it is 4, it is 10 million, pi, it is anything. It is in fact all of them simultaneously. And yet, the totality of all possible numbers, including imaginary numbers, is held in a single symbol, 0 divided by 0. And what does that mean? 0 in relation to 0, which is what? That. Indescribable in relation to itself. Isn't it amazing? Mathematically, the symbol we have for the origin of things, the singularity, is in fact indescribable. They call it shunya in the Buddhist tradition, but it is the indescribable in relation to itself. This is mathematics. But in terms of the physics earlier description, when we find the total breakdown of all equations, space and time itself cease to be. That from which the Big Bang emerges is therefore spaceless, timeless. And yet, it is not separate from space and time. Space-time are inherent in it as a potential, in the same manner as all the numbers are inherent in your singularity. So that spaceless, timeless, because it is spaceless, it is also indivisible. Because if you can divide, then you have space. If you have no space, you cannot divide. How do you conceive of such a thing? Well, you can only conceive of it as a minute infinitesimal point, and yet you have space which is not point. So even that conception breaks down. You cannot conceive. In fact, the Upanishad specifically says mind falls away from it, because all thought forms of mind are in fact belonging to space-time. That is beyond space-time, therefore there is no conception of it possible. And yet, let's look at it another way. All the universe is born out of that. Where is that when the universe is born? And what is the relationship of the universe with it? The universe is always in it, because there is nothing other than that. Where is it? It is in all things in the universe. It is immanent, and the whole universe is born within itself. There is a complete identity between the two, and yet that exceeds the universe. So there is the famous statement of the Upanishad, out of that complete, this complete emerges. And even after this complete emerges, that remains complete. But suggested within is the idea that this emerging is still part of that. That is therefore immanent, we use the word. It is in everything, it is the essence of everything. Without that, this could not exist. It supports the atom, it supports the molecule, it is the source of all the qualities which emerge. That is ananta guna, infinite quality. Here articulated in finite qualities, finite forms, finite appearances. Okay, but behind each finite form and quality is still the potential infinite quality seated as a support. Because that support is there, this can express a limited quality. In a sense, you can say each object is like a lens exaggerating a facet, a color of the totality of the potential rainbow, which is in each thing. This is just a way of describing it. But interestingly, throughout, in each thing, because that is immanent, you also carry it within you as the immanent thing. You also in reality are that, although you are identified with your form and your limited qualities. And the method of the Rishi therefore is to reverse the process. Turn my attention not outwards to forms, but to turn it inward to the essence out of which my form emerges, my consciousness emerges, my thought emerges. Out of where does my thought come? And I go through a reverse process of awareness. And then I can go back all the way until I become one in identity with that, because that's always me. And here's the interesting part. Thought cannot conceive it, but in identity you can experience it. The beauty of this description is this. Perhaps you cannot describe in words what you experience at that level, but you can experience it and be one with it and still be in the form, because that is in form also without losing itself. And this is the status of the Jivan Mukta. He is in the total freedom of that out of which the Big Bang came. In other words, the whole universe is within him. He is greater than the universe, freer than the universe, and yet he is in the universe as a participant and player. Okay? This, they said, is the whole point of life. We, as that, entered into the domain of form and limitation in order to experience form and limitation, but from the freedom of that status. So the first entry is a sense of self-loss into limitation. But then there's the second movement of recovery of our freedom in the form. And then we become conscious participants and players of that. There's a little more which I have not brought because we are looking at it from a physics angle. From the psychology angle, from the essence consciousness angle, we say that. How will you describe that subjectively? Because it is formless, timeless, spaceless. How do you describe it? There is a description still you can keep. That is, it is. It simply is. That's the only way you can describe it. There is no other description possible. It is. So its first characteristic is it exists. Sat. But in its existence, it's not a blank existence. It is utterly aware that it exists. It is as existence. It is sheer awareness of its own existence. And its awareness is existence. Its existence is its awareness. And therefore Chit is its second characteristic. And that awareness, as it knows itself, is sheer bliss, Ananda. So the way it knows itself is Satchidananda, but when it expresses itself in limitation of form and limited quality, all relationships, all experiences are as if expressions or colors of its Satchidananda, but in limitation. And because they are in limitation, they are distorted. And yet, in our life, we have this experience. Underlying everything, there is a kind of a joy. There is even a joy in being unhappy. Notice when you're in deep depression, what do? You call up a friend. You know how unhappy I am. And the fellow says, get out of it. Let's go and watch a movie. No, you don't understand. I'm suffering. I'm sad. And if you observe behind it, there's something which is happy about the experience and the drama of being sad. But that's not the Satchidananda, but it's a reflection of the fact that behind it all, there is a bliss and a joy of the whole cosmos and the whole manifestation of the cosmos. But when you are a Jivan Mukta, that bliss and joy is revealed. It's no more clouded, it's no more distorted, it is fully revealed. And we can play as free, conscious, divine beings. That's the journey of our awakening. That's the big picture.
Good evening, sir. I am Rajesh. You previously told that if we elect the supreme power directly, say the prime minister, and he in turn forms the relevant short governance, then it would be better. So I just wanted to know, in this present situation, present scenario, is any part of the world following the procedure which you have said?
Yes.
And still
yes.
be successful?
In fact, the American system is based on a presidential model, but it is distorted by the fact that it is still party-based. And the president himself becomes responsible for the day-to-day execution. Sri Aurobindo pointed to the French system, which is a modification of the presidential system, as better suited for India. So there the president is elected by the people, and then the president chooses a team and observes them and makes sure they work efficiently, but he is not directly responsible. So a modification of this type at the top. But then in the governance structure at the bottom, at the grassroots, he said it should be a panchayat framework. That is, the man responsible for your roads being clean should be your neighbor. That way, if the road is not clean, you don't have to worry about some babu sitting in Delhi whom you cannot reach, but he's your next door neighbor. You can shake him up and say, why is it not clean? So at the grassroots level, an extreme decentralization, where local taxes are invested for local development, for example. Okay, so there's a very close expression of your life and organization of the freedom of your local space. At the top, a central system of the presidential model, and in between something to link the two. And the way Sri Aurobindo put it, he said it does not matter too much how we develop it, as long as it is an expression of the innate Indian genius. The point being, create a system that you feel will work for you and then modify it and perfect it until it works for you. Don't imitate and follow something which is lopsided for you.
Swamiji, what is the spacelessness you are talking about? Because you told that at the singularity, the space and time ceases.
Yes.
What remains? Because the space, where it will
Yes.
go?
It's a very important issue. The moment you have the singularity at the point of the Big Bang, you see the way we visualize it, the whole universe collapsing, but then the rest is empty space. Actually, space itself curves and collapses. So what's left? Non-space. There is no space. How do you conceive of that? You can't. Your mind needs an underlying space to conceive. And that's the problem. To know that, you cannot know it by conception, you can only know it by identity of experience. And you can experience that spaceless, timeless condition. But then space and time are one of the expressions of it, the way it relates to its own possibilities. Yes.
Sir,
Yes. But it can be grasped.
in the subject
Yes.
of your today's talk,
Oh, yes.
can you connect it with the descendants of supramental power, which is told by Sri Aurobindo?
Sri Aurobindo said something very important about the present period of transition for humanity. He said, just as there has been a certain sequence of unfoldment of consciousness in evolution, from plant to animal to human, the sequence does not stop with the human. The human is the present highest developed consciousness, but not the last. There are gradations above the human intellect, and this is an experience we have. What is a genius consciousness? A genius is able to rise above intellect's limitations and see things, know things, bypassing logic. And within that there are further gradations. And in the yogic knowledge, we describe gradations of consciousness, awareness, which widen out to the full freedom in identity with that, the source of it all. If such is the potential of our own consciousness, are we right to say that human being is the peak? Is it not possible that more and more people will grow into a higher consciousness and live by those higher statuses which are non-intellectual? They transcend rationality. They can articulate rationally, but in their working they have direct access to knowledge. And this is one of the characteristics of that higher next consciousness. So Sri Aurobindo actually said there is imminent a transition from the intellect to a higher level of consciousness, based on which you will actually have within humanity as if a new species, a new level of awareness and a different power of articulation of that awareness, which to the humans would be as great as to the animals the human mind is great. And one of the characteristics of that will be spontaneous access to all knowledge. Second characteristic will be a natural sense of oneness and connection with all things. Both of these we know are things which have been realized by great yogis. But it will cease to be something available only to a few yogis. It will become more and more the dominant status in a whole new level of the human species. So this is the idea behind it. I'm not going into technical details, but this is the sense of it. And that's why he said we are going through a crisis of the intellect. The nature of the modern crisis you observe, all problems which we face as humanity are such that they cannot be solved by new systems and new laws. They require a shift in human consciousness. And that itself is a sign that evolution is pushing forward to a new level of consciousness.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Sri Aurobindo has said already the supramental power has descended on earth.
Yes, that's why I said I'm not going into technical details. I'm just presenting this as an idea that there is this new consciousness, but it has still to be organized and developed in humanity. A change is already taking place. As an example, the common man today is spontaneously aware that he is part of a larger humanity. and has a sense of relation with the whole earth. This was not so if you go back 40 years, where people thought in terms of national interests only, at the level of common man. There was a much narrower sense of identity. We were not connected with the whole world in the same way as we are today. And to a great extent, technology is helping that. I'll put it another way. With technology, we are interested in knowing what's happening around the world because within our consciousness, there is a turning out to relate to all, to feel a deeper sense of oneness with humanity and so on.
We'll take a last question. Sir, you talked about this Vimana Shastra. I have read that IISc Bangalore, they tried some things from Vimana Shastra and they didn't succeed it. So I just wanted to know what are the recent developments on the research of this Vimana Shastra.
The most successful work done so far on the Vimana Shastra was by Dr. C.S.R. Prabhu. He is director of NIC, National Informatics Center. He is based, I believe, in Hyderabad still. And you can look at some of the work where he has replicated actual metallic formula and, as I said, with unusual properties. The problem with Vimana Shastra is because of the technical terms, it's very difficult to understand everything. We get the drift of it. But for example, if you were to take a modern manual of rocketry and take it back 100 years and people looked at it, they wouldn't know what the terms mean. A term like semiconductor did not exist 50 years ago. They wouldn't understand if you say semiconductor and they would try to interpret it in some different way. This is the problem with the technical vocabulary of the Vimana Shastra. But in the description overall, you get a sense of it. For example, in they describe 4 different types of Vimanas. One of the Vimanas they describe, in the center there is a large tube. Around that tube are 3 cylinders which feed oils into the tube which are burnt in the tube. And in the tube the fire is called Vaishvanara Nala Yantra, that is the universal fire machine. Now here is a description very similar to a rocket. In these 3 cylinders, the oils which are used are actually described from which plant, what extract, by what process do you refine it, purify it, and then in what proportion you mix it. Here's a formula which describes a specialized fuel. Can we replicate it? Well, half the plant names do not match with the way we know them. And then they have terms, they say heat it up to this degree. Now the measure of temperature of that time is not known to us. Like today we have centigrade and Fahrenheit. If you didn't know how they related, you couldn't make sense of it. So all of these are practical issues in replication. But I'm trying to point to something more. I'm trying to point to the genius which led to this technology. The means by which this knowledge was accessed, that is the relevance today. These examples are there to remind you that they have done it, we can do it. And what I want to point here is the science behind it. And I mentioned the Panchabhutani and all that precisely because those are the fundamental principles of the ancient Indian science. And let me point to another distinction of modern science and the Indian science. Modern science largely emerged in Europe at a time when they went in a reaction against religion. Religion had become a suffocating force, suppressing free thinking. And therefore the science which was born at that time in the age of enlightenment in Europe rejected God, rejected anything associated with religion, rejected all non-materiality. So it became a materialistic and a reductionist science. In India, we never had this problem. Science was a quest for reality. And reality we saw was multiple, it had many gradations. And we mapped out all those gradations and their interconnections. Having had this, the Indian science is more rich, more complete, it is not reductionist. It actually looks at correlations between gross matter, life energy, and thought energy. It links all 3. And the result is a technology which actually utilizes life principles. For example, in certain formulae, they will ask for a plant juice to be used. If you replace the plant juice by a pure dead chemical, you won't get the same result. It has to be living plants, fresh juice, because life force is involved here and its characteristics. And this is the quality of Ayurveda. If you take an Ayurvedic medicine, take out only the active ingredient, you'll get some result. but not the same result as you get from that medicine, because that has life force. Living food as opposed to dead food has a very different effect. In fact, we are able to measure today with the more advanced instruments the distinction between the same chemical from a living plant and from a dead chemical. And we can see the difference and measure those differences. The same vitamins, as they are chemically synthesized, are different in structure than when they are synthesized in a living plant. And it makes a difference because we are living bodies, we are not dead machines. So all of these things are part of that knowledge. But the key point I want to bring to is this. In that deeper science, they not only looked at the way things work, they looked at how they work and went to the root. And I want to place this before you as a last idea because it's going to be the future and I believe India will lead in it. The question of gravitation is still unresolved in modern science. We do not know what is gravity. We do not know how it works. We do not know why it works. We cannot modify it. We have learned a little bit of magnetism and electromagnetism. We still don't know what is magnetism, but we know the laws by which they operate. We can create an electromagnet. We don't know how the electromagnet works. And most important, we do not know the link between gravity and electromagnetism. These are major lacunae of modern science. In the ancient science, we knew these things. And let me tell you, they very explicitly state the Vayu principle is the cause of electromagnetism and gravity. If you master the Vayu principle, you have the link between gravitation and electromagnetism, and the result is by electromagnetic manipulation, you can modify gravity. Now, this is the kind of science that is part of, including the Vimana Shastra as well as other texts, way beyond anything we understand. So obviously, when people enter in a very superficial way, it's obscure. But if you set aside that and make a fresh quest with this deeper insight and deeper approach, we will rediscover the link between gravity and electromagnetism. We will learn to master gravity. It will revolutionize transport. It will revolutionize space travel. It will revolutionize all life on Earth. This is the promise of the coming future. And I hope and pray that it will be from India, and perhaps it will be from one of you. Namaste.